The first time I saw Kael'thar on the medical ward, with his jaw wired shut and a feeding tube snaking down his throat, I thought he'd been caught in an airlock malfunction. But the truth was so much worse and so much better, depending on which side of the story you were on. "What happened to you?" I asked, my translator chip, converting my Velascan chirps into standard galactic. And the medical attendant, a 6-armed Threshan with tired eyes, just shook her head and said, "He grabbed an Earthborn." Those 3 words hung in the air like a death sentence. And I felt my spine frills flatten in shock, because everyone knew the rumors about Earth, about the death world that had just joined the Galactic Council 6 cycles ago. But most of us thought they were exaggerations. Propaganda to make the newcomers seem more impressive than they actually were. Kael'thar was a Dranic, nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 arms corded with muscle that could bend steel beams. And he was one of the station's most feared enforcers for the mining consortium. Someone who settled disputes by simply being in the room. And now he lay there making pitiful, whimpering sounds through his ruined face. I left the medical bay with my hands trembling, my curiosity burning hotter than a star's core, because I had to know what kind of being could do this to someone like Kael'thar. The station's central hub was crowded as always. Thousands of species from across the galaxy moving through the massive rotating ring that served as our marketplace, living quarters and administrative center. And I pushed through the crowds asking questions, following the gossip trail like an investigator tracking radiation signatures. The story emerged in pieces from a dozen different sources, each adding details that seemed more impossible than the last. Kael'thar had been working collection for one of the gambling dens in the lower sections, and apparently an Earthborn had run up a significant debt, something like 3,000 credits from their terrible luck at the gravity dice tables. And when she'd tried to leave without paying, Kael'thar had done what he always did with people who owed money but didn't want to pay. He'd reach down to grab her by the collar and lift her off her feet. A simple intimidation tactic he'd used 1,000 times before on 100 different species. And that's when everything went wrong for him. A Zentari merchant told me the human girl had moved like lightning, her hand snapping up to grip his wrist, and the sound of Kael'thar's arm breaking echoed through 3 levels of the station. A Pelasian dock worker swore he'd heard the human said something cold and quiet before she acted. Something like, "Where I come from, you ask before you touch." A maintenance drone's footage had been wiped, but the technician who'd seen it before the deletion wore this expression of horrified awe when describing how the small Earthborn female, barely reaching Kael'thar's mid-torso, had systematically dismantled a being more than twice her size and probably 4 times her mass. I found myself obsessed with finding this human. This impossible creature who had shattered our station's most dangerous enforcer like he was made of glass. And I knew it was foolish, because Earth was still mostly a mystery to the galaxy, and humans were rare this far from their home system. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. My name is Syl'veth and I'm a xenoanthropologist by training, which is a fancy way of saying I study how different species interact and build cultures together. And I'd been assigned to Station Meridian specifically to observe and document the integration of Earth's people into galactic society. But in 6 cycles I'd only encountered maybe a dozen humans, and none of them had done anything more remarkable than exist while looking somewhat fragile compared to most spacefaring species. The security footage from the gambling den was locked down by station administration, which only happened when something really bad or really embarrassing had occurred. And the human girl had apparently paid her debt in full immediately after the incident and disappeared into the residential sectors. I spent 2 days checking the registration logs, cross-referencing with docking manifests and work permits, until I found her name listed on a recent arrival roster, Maya Torres, age 24 standard years, registered occupation listed as freelance security consultant, which seemed like a cosmic joke. Given what she'd done to our station's premier muscle for hire, I found her in one of the observation lounges on the outer ring, sitting alone at a table with a cup of something steaming and a datapad displaying what looked like star charts. And my first thought wasn't about her being dangerous or terrifying, but about how surprisingly human she looked. Which sounds stupid, because, of course, a human looks human. But I mean, she looked so much like the Velascan ideal of beauty that it was startling. She had long dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, skin that was this warm brown color that seemed to glow softly in the lounge's ambient light, and when she looked up at my approach, her eyes were this deep amber color that held intelligence and wariness in equal measure. and her ears were rounded and small, completely unlike my own pointed ones that could swivel to catch sounds, which marked her as definitively not Velascan, despite the similar facial structure. "Maya Torres?" I asked, and she tensed immediately, her body language shifting from relaxed to ready in a heartbeat, and I held up my hands in the universal gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm a researcher. My name is Syl'veth, and I study cultural integration. And I was hoping I could ask you some questions about what happened with Kael'thar." She stared at me for a long moment, those amber eyes reading me like a book, and then she smiled slightly and gestured to the empty chair across from her. And that smile transformed her face from pretty to absolutely radiant in a way that made my heart skip. "Let me guess," she said, her voice carrying an accent that my translator marked as North American English variant, smooth and rich, like aged Velascan honey wine. "You want to know how the tiny human girl beat up the big scary alien. And you're wondering if the rumors about Earth are true." I settled into the chair, my tail curling around the base nervously, and I nodded, because there was no point in being dishavardic about my intentions. She took a sip of her drink, which smelled like some kind of caffeinated earth beverage, and looked out the massive viewport at the stars spinning slowly past as the station rotated. "The thing is," she continued, "Kael'thar didn't do anything that unusual by station standards. I'm told he's grabbed people before, and it's just how things are done here when someone owes money. But on Earth we have different rules about personal space and consent, and where I grew up, you don't put your hands on someone without permission." Her voice was calm, almost casual, but I could hear steel underneath, a core of absolute conviction. I didn't want to hurt him as badly as I did. Honestly, I just reacted on instinct. And my instincts are calibrated for Earth gravity and Earth physics. And I forgot for a second that most species out here are a lot more fragile than humans. That word, fragile, coming from someone who barely reached my shoulder height and probably massed half what I did, should have been absurd, but I'd seen Kael'thar in that medical bed, and I knew she was telling the simple truth. "Your world is classified as a high-gravity death world," I said, pulling up my datapad to reference my notes. "Standard gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, which is nearly double what most council worlds maintain. And your atmospheric pressure, radiation exposure, bacterial load, chemical composition, and predator density are all well above galactic average for sapient homeworlds." Maya nodded, looking amused. "Yeah, Earth is basically trying to kill everything on it all the time, and humans evolved to be hard to kill as a result. Our bones are denser, our muscles are stronger, pound for pound. Our healing factor is frankly ridiculous by most species standards, and we're endurance predators, which means we're built to chase things until they collapse from exhaustion." She paused, and something sad flickered across her face. "The problem is that out here, in your low-gravity stations with your lighter-built species, I have to constantly hold back, constantly remember that what's normal interaction for me might seriously injure someone else. And sometimes I forget, like when someone grabs me suddenly and my combat training kicks in before my brain catches up." I leaned forward, fascinated, because this was exactly the kind of cultural friction I was supposed to be documenting. "You have combat training?" She laughed, and it was a bright sound that made several nearby patrons turn to look. "I was a Marine Corps martial arts instructor before I left Earth. Spent 6 years teaching people how to disable threats efficiently. And when I mustered out, I figured I'd try my luck in the wider galaxy. Maybe use my skills as a bodyguard or security specialist. But it turns out that most species don't want to hire someone from a death world because they assume we're all violent sociopaths." The bitterness in her voice was clear, and I felt a pang of sympathy because I'd read the reports, seen the discrimination that Earth's people face despite their official council membership. So instead I've been taking odd jobs, flying, security for cargo haulers, mostly. And I came to Station Meridian because I heard the mining companies paid well for anyone willing to work the deep asteroid extraction rigs. But I made the mistake of thinking I could relax and have some fun at the gambling dens. And my luck was terrible. And then Kael'thar made the mistake of grabbing me. She met my eyes directly, and I saw genuine regret there. I really didn't mean to hurt him that badly. I just moved to break his grip, and his arms snapped like a dry twig. And then he came at me with his other 3 arms. And my training took over, and I defended myself. And it was over in maybe 5 seconds. And by the end, he was on the ground with a broken jaw and 3 shattered arms and some cracked ribs. And everyone was screaming. And I realized I'd just become exactly the kind of violent human that everyone expects us to be. The vulnerability in her admission struck something deep in my chest. And I realized that this human, this dangerous and powerful being, was also just a young woman trying to find her place in a galaxy that feared her for circumstances of her birth. You paid the debt, I said, and she nodded. Every credit, plus compensation for Kael'thar's medical bills, which pretty much wiped out my savings, and I fully expect station security to deport me or arrest me any day now. She looked down at her datapad, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. The worst part is that I came out here because I wanted to see the galaxy, meet new species, be part of something bigger than Earth's little corner of space. And instead, I'm just confirming every prejudice they already have about deathworlders being dangerous primitives who solve everything with violence. I made a decision then that would change both our lives, though I didn't know it at the time. Would you like some help? I asked, and she looked up, surprised. I have some connections with the station administration through my research position, and I think I can get the incident classified as self-defense, especially since Kael'thar initiated physical contact without consent, which technically violates station personal safety protocols, even if the rules aren't usually enforced. And additionally, I could use an assistant for my integration research, someone with first-hand experience of the human perspective. And the position comes with a stipend and station residence permit. Maya stared at me like I'd just offered her a ship full of platinum. Why would you do that for me? I thought about my answer carefully, because I wanted to be honest. Because the whole point of the Galactic Council is that we're supposed to be learning from each other, growing together, building something better than any of our species could alone. And if we just keep treating Earth's people like dangerous animals instead of potential friends and colleagues, then we're failing at the most basic level. And besides, I think your perspective could really help my research, and selfishly, I find you fascinating. That last part came out before I could stop it, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. My skin shifting to a darker purple, that definitely gave away my emotional state. Maya smiled again, that radiant expression that made the stars outside seem dimmer by comparison, and she extended her hand across the table. You've got yourself an assistant, Syl'veth. I reached out to take her hand, and her grip was firm and warm, and I was suddenly very aware of the strength in those fingers that had broken Kael'thar's bones, but also the gentleness with which she controlled that strength. The careful calibration of pressure. That said, she was thinking about not hurting me. The next few weeks were a revelation in more ways than one, because working with Maya meant seeing the station through completely new eyes. And I began to notice things I'd taken for granted that were actually serious problems. The human quarters were designed for standard gravity, which meant Maya had to wear weighted clothing just to maintain her bone density and muscle mass. And the food dispensers didn't stock Earth-compatible proteins in sufficient variety, which meant she was surviving on mostly bland nutrient paste, supplemented with expensive imports from Earth supply ships. The environmental controls didn't account for Earth's day-night cycle, and Maya suffered from constant sleep disruption because her circadian rhythm was calibrated for 24 hours instead of the station's 30-hour rotation. The medical bay had exactly one human qualified physician for a population of nearly 200 Earthborn on station, and the waiting list for appointments was 3 weeks long for anything non-emergency. I documented everything, filed reports with the integration committee, and started pushing for changes, and Maya helped by connecting me with other humans who shared their experiences. And slowly a picture emerged of a species that was struggling to adapt to a galaxy that hadn't really made space for them yet. But I also learned about Maya as a person, not just as a research subject or a representative of her species. And I discovered that she was funny in this dry, understated way, that she loved music and could play something called a guitar that she'd brought from Earth, that she was fiercely loyal to her friends and had left behind a large family that she missed terribly, that she had nightmares sometimes about her military service that she didn't like to discuss. And that despite her dangerous capabilities, she was one of the gentlest people I'd ever met. Always careful, always conscious of her strength, always worried about accidentally hurting someone. We fell into an easy partnership, working together during the station's day cycles and often sharing meals in the evening. And I found myself looking forward to seeing her each morning with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. My colleague Threshik, a Pelasian engineer who'd known me for years, pulled me aside one day and said bluntly, "You're falling for the human, aren't you?" and I'd stammered denials, but Threshik just laughed and said, Syl, I've known you since Academy, and I've never seen you this animated about anyone. Just be careful. Because interspecies relationships are complicated enough without adding a deathworlder to the mix. The complication arrived in the form of Kael'thar's employer, a crime syndicate called the Obsidian Chain that ran most of the illegal gambling and protection rackets on the station. And they weren't happy about what had happened to their enforcer. I was in my quarters reviewing research data when my door chimed, and Maya was standing there with her face pale and her jaw set in determination. We have a problem, she said, and showed me a message on her datapad. An anonymous threat that promised retribution for Kael'thar's injuries. That called her a violent animal that needed to be put down. That gave her 48 hours to leave the station or face consequences. My blood went cold, because I'd heard stories about the Obsidian Chain, about people who crossed them, ending up spaced through airlocks or dissolved in industrial vats. And Maya was just one person against an entire criminal organization. We need to go to station security, I said, but Maya shook her head. I've already tried. They said they can't act on anonymous threats. And reading between the lines, I think some of the security officers are on the Obsidian Chain's payroll. She sat down on my couch, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked truly scared. Maybe I should just leave, go find another station, start over somewhere else. The thought of Maya leaving, of never seeing her again, hit me like a physical blow. And I realized that Threshik had been absolutely right about my feelings. No, I said, with more force than I intended. You didn't do anything wrong. You defended yourself against assault. And you've already paid compensation. And you're not going to be driven away by criminals who are mad that their bully picked on the wrong person. Maya looked at me with surprise and something else, something warm that made my heart race. Syl, I appreciate that, but I'm not worth you getting hurt over. We've known each other for less than a month, and you have a career and a life here. And I'm just some human you took pity on. I crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched. You're not just some human, you're my friend. And you're a person who deserves to be here as much as anyone. And I'm not going to let these criminals intimidate you into leaving. I paused, then decided to risk everything. And honestly, you're more than my friend. Or I want you to be more. And I know this is terrible timing and completely unprofessional given our working relationship. But I care about you, Maya Torres, and the thought of you leaving makes me feel like someone's removed the air from the room. Maya turned to look at me fully, her amber eyes wide, and then she smiled, soft and genuine and beautiful. I care about you too, Syl, more than I probably should. And I've been trying not to think about it because I didn't want to complicate things. But since we're being honest, you're the best thing that's happened to me since I left Earth. And these last few weeks working with you have been the happiest I've been in years. She reached out and took my hand, her warm fingers interlacing with my own slender ones. And the gesture felt more intimate than anything I'd ever experienced. So what do we do? I thought about it, my researcher's brain running through scenarios and probabilities. We fight back, but not with violence. We use information. We expose the Obsidian Chain's operations to the council inspectors. Because the mining consortium that officially runs this station has been looking for an excuse to clean out the criminal elements without appearing to crack down too hard on station culture. And if we can provide them with documented evidence of the chain's activities, they'll have to act. Maya's expression shifted to something fierce and determined. I know a few other humans on station who've had run-ins with the chain. And if we're building a case, I can get testimonies. And there's a human data specialist, named Chen, who works in station logistics, who probably has access to financial records that could show money laundering. We spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of covert activity, and I discovered that Maya's military training included intelligence gathering and operational planning, and she coordinated our small group of allies with impressive efficiency. Chen provided financial data that showed the Obsidian Chain moving millions of credits through shell companies. A Zentari merchant gave testimony about protection, money, extortion. 3 other humans documented assaults and threats similar to Maya's experience. And I compiled everything into a comprehensive report that detailed systematic criminal activity, including bribery of station security personnel. We submitted it simultaneously to the Mining Consortium's Internal Affairs Division, the Galactic Council's Station Oversight Committee, and the Independent Merchant Coalition that represented a significant economic bloc on Meridian, ensuring that no single entity could bury the information. The response was swift and dramatic, with council inspectors arriving within a day and station security's entire command structure being suspended pending investigation. And within a week, the Obsidian Chain's leadership was arrested, their assets frozen, and their protection rackets dismantled. Kael'thar, interestingly, provided testimony against his former employers in exchange for reduced charges, and he requested a meeting with Maya that I attended as her support. He was out of medical, though still wearing a jaw brace and moving carefully, and when he saw Maya he actually stepped back instinctively. "I wanted to apologize," he said through his translator, his voice distorted by the medical equipment. "What I did, grabbing you without permission, it was wrong. And I'd done it so many times to so many people that I didn't even think about it. But that doesn't excuse it, and you had every right to defend yourself. And I'm sorry." Maya studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I accept your apology, and I'm sorry I hurt you so badly. I reacted with more force than necessary, and I should have had better control." Kael'thar made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You had perfect control. You could have killed me in that first second if you'd wanted to. But you didn't. You just disabled me, and that's more mercy than I'd have shown in your position. And I've learned something about respect and consent that I should have known all along." He paused, looking between us. "The other thing I learned is that humans are terrifying. And I'm glad you're on our side now." The station changed after that, slowly but noticeably, because the Obsidian Chain's removal created space for legitimate businesses and better station governance. And the publicity around the case, including Maya's role in it, shifted the narrative about humans from dangerous primitives to valued community members who'd helped clean up corruption. The Integration Committee actually started implementing my recommendations, improving conditions for Earth's people on the station, and I got a commendation for my research work. And Maya's reputation shifted from violent offender to local hero, and she started getting legitimate security consulting contracts that paid well and didn't require her to leave the station. We became an official couple, though that took some navigation of Velascan and human courtship customs, which were different in interesting ways, and I learned that humans kissed with their mouths, which seemed unhygienic until I tried it and discovered it was actually amazing. And Maya learned that Velascans showed affection through spine frill displays and shared meals, and we built something together that was uniquely ours. Neither fully human nor fully Velascan, but some new thing that belonged to both of us. 6 months after the incident that started everything, I was giving a presentation at a galactic xenosociology conference about human integration challenges, and Maya was in the audience, and I concluded my talk with a quote that she'd said to me during one of our late-night conversations. "A human friend once told me, the measure of civilization isn't how we treat people who are like us, it's how we treat people who are different. And if we can't make space for those differences, then we're not really civilized. We're just a bunch of tribes pretending to be a community." The audience of researchers from 100 different species gave a gesture of approval. And afterward, Maya met me outside the conference hall with that radiant smile that still made my heart skip. "Good speech," she said, and took my hand. "I'm proud of you." We walked together through the station's central hub, past the marketplace where a dozen species traded goods and stories, past the observation lounges, where beings from across the galaxy looked out at the stars, past the residential sectors, where humans and Velascans and Dranik and countless others made their homes side by side. And I thought about how close we'd come to losing this, how a single moment of violence had led to friendship, and then love, and then real change, and how sometimes the most important discoveries aren't about distant stars or alien technologies, but about understanding each other. Kael'thar still eats solid food with difficulty, sometimes, and he'll probably always have some residual pain from his injuries. But he's working as a rehabilitation counselor now, helping other former enforcers and criminals transition to legitimate employment. And sometimes he and Maya have coffee together and talk about second chances and redemption, which is something I never would have predicted. The galaxy is vast and strange and full of wonders. But the most wonderful thing I've ever encountered isn't a cosmic anomaly or an ancient artifact. It's the woman walking beside me. The Earthborn girl who broke an enforcer's bones and then helped break a criminal empire, and who somehow decided that I was worth her affection. And every day I'm grateful that Kael'thar made the mistake of grabbing her collar. Because without that moment of violence and its aftermath, I might never have met Maya Torres, and my life would have been so much smaller and dimmer. And the station would still be suffering under the obsidian chain's control. And sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes, if we're brave enough to turn them into opportunities for change. Now, when people ask me about the incident, about the day an Earthborn girl put the station's most feared enforcer in the medical ward eating through a tube, I tell them it's not a story about human violence or deathworld danger. It's a story about respect and consent and consequences, and about how sometimes the smallest person in the room is the strongest, and how strength used wisely can protect not just yourself, but an entire community, and about how love can grow in the strangest circumstances if you're open to it, and that's the truth that matters. Not the sensationalized version that focuses on broken bones and feeding tubes, but the deeper truth about dignity and choice and building something better together.